Today's video will be less about the hardware used and more about the packaging. If the thumbnail hasn't spoiled it for you already, this all will be going into a rather unusual enclosure. First, let's quickly run through what we will be using. This will be an AMD based system centered around the Ryzen 3 3200G, but this time accompanied by a discrete GPU, the GTX 1060 6GB. Primary storage consists of a 256GB SSD, and for secondary storage we have a 500GB hard drive and a 1TB slim hard drive that I could not be asked to remove after I installed it in the first place. It has the dreaded reallocator sector count smart error, but it works perfectly fine. I mean, I've had drives last for more than 5 years like this and they work perfectly, with smart insisting that they are about to kick the bucket, so make of that what you will. Both hard drives are freebies, so you can't really go wrong with zero cost, can you? For cooling this 4-core 4-thread CPU, I am using a Ryzen 5 cooler from the first generation, the one that still has the copper vapor chamber before AMD cut costs and removed it. After what I did to the CPU, it never went above 62C, so I'm quite happy about that. Finally, the RAM is a 16GB kit of 3000 Mbps Corsair. Thankfully, now that the GPU shortage is over, or at least paused for the moment due to the end of mining, I began perhaps foolishly to expect that I would be able to set my sights exclusively on Turing and RDNA 1 or newer cards, but unfortunately that is a very tall order considering the cost of living crisis looming large over all of us. And that is in addition to the fact that the new car prices are still ridiculously high, compounded by the fact that the RTX 40 series prices seem to be a bit out of touch. I mean, I am holding some hope for RDNA 3 coming along and smashing everything to bits when it comes to prices, but honestly AMD is a publicly traded company, so it's fair to expect that they wouldn't do it out of the goodness of their hearts, but for a competitive advantage against Nvidia, and these days I guess at the low end, well, against Intel as well. But let's set aside all that for the moment and look at the enclosure. A Mac G5 from circa 2004 that is all aluminium, and even by today's standards looks absolutely amazing. The issue with repurposing this Mac case for the PC is that it is mirrored. Thanks, Apple! To get around this fact, a custom upside down secondary motherboard tray had to be installed. This bit wasn't done by myself, I bought it with the necessary modifications about 9-ish years ago and finished the project. After a 3-year stint as my media PC, I kept the case in storage ever since, thinking that one day I will definitely put a nice PC in it. Although there are plenty of holes for ventilation, adding fans will somewhat spoil the aesthetic because the fixings will be visible from the outside, so I decided to go for something lower powered that would not require a ton of cooling. Previously, believe it or not, I had this thing running an overclocked inferno of an FX 8 core with a water cooler and Nvidia GTX 590 that was toasty no matter what. Guess that's what you get when you try to cool two GPUs on the same board with a single fan. But that is all ancient history by this point, and the motherboard goes in without a hitch, leaving me to concentrate on getting the PSU in and hard drives. Mounting the PSU wasn't very straightforward because previously I used a custom bracket to hold it in that I seem to have misplaced. Plan B is to go with some extra strong double-sided sticky tape and one screw directly to the bottom of the case. This worked great as the PSU is now held in very securely, with the downside being that posting this PC across the country is out of the question because couriers aren't necessarily known for their white glove approach to handling large heavy boxes. Cable management isn't really a thing either for this build, so you'll have to excuse the SpaghettiOs, but on the other hand there isn't a clear side panel, so it really doesn't matter all that much. Only the GPU provided a bit of a surprise. There was a piece of metal from the case preventing the bracket from fully seating home, so instead of ripping everything out to solve the problem, I just cut up the offending part of the GPU front plate away. No, this will not hurt the GPU or anything like that. On a side note, I really miss EVGA GPUs. Although I don't really feel any attachment to any particular brand, all my previous experiences with EVGA customer service have been overwhelmingly positive, and that is something I unfortunately cannot generalize for every GPU maker. I had to fiddle a lot with this hard drive. I did manage to get it installed and secured in there in the end, but as previously mentioned, afterwards I discovered it had a smart error. I will leave it in there and just add a 500GB one down at the bottom of the case later on. And after a pitiful half-hearted attempt at cable management, we are done. Let's have a look at some pictures and you tell me if you think that this sleek all-aluminium retro look PC would fit nicely in your office, living room or bedroom, or if you rather have an RGB soup. First off, we start with Heaven, which is a very old benchmark by this point, but I do like to keep it in the benchmarking roster. It is very consistent, focusing almost exclusively on the GPU. At 102.1 FPS on average, it is exactly in line with what I expected from a 1066GB, which was somewhere between 100 and 105 without overclocking and below 110 FPS with a moderate OC. That's why I love Heaven. I always run it first, and if there are any issues, they all automatically get flagged up. In Superposition, we get 69 FPS on average. It makes sense, it's a much newer benchmark compared to Heaven, but by this point it's also getting a bit old in age as it was released just over 5.5 years ago now. Yes, something brand new like a RTX 3060 will devour it, but that car still costs almost double this whole complete PC just on its own. Next up, Rocket League, which runs very well with in excess of 200 FPS, and for a relatively entry-level system that is a great result. This game tends to be a bit inconsistent in my view, especially with AMD CPUs bouncing all over the place when paired with different systems utilizing the same GPU. For instance, when pairing a 1060 with an Intel i5-8400, the FPS almost doubles to around 340 FPS, but then goes back to 200 FPS when paired with an AMD 2700X, which is leagues ahead of the i5 in every metric. Not to mention today's subject, the 3200G. It's the first type of CPU bottlenecks we will encounter today, unfortunately, and in my opinion this is the subjectively less egregious of the two types. It limits the average FPS, yes, but the frame time consistency is still really good, so most gamers won't really notice or care. Fortnite might be able to claim that it is technically running with 60 FPS at epic 1080p, but in reality it's really not playable. This unfortunately is the second type of CPU bottleneck where the average frame rates aren't really that impacted, as the 1060 performs almost identically on much faster processors in this scenario. It's just that 3200G can't keep up and it results in the unacceptable frame time spikes make the game all but unplayable. Dropping down to medium, keeping the resolution 100% scaling and epic draw distance gives the CPU a bit of breathing room and pushes the average frame rate to 148 FPS, which is very decent in itself, but more importantly, the borderline game-breaking stutters are nowhere to be found. This is a shortcoming that can be entirely laid at the feet of the CPU, as it only has 4 physical cores and the same number of threads. Ryzen 0 Dawn got a big recent-ish update that brought in DLSS and FSR, and this allows us to go to ultimate quality with FSR quality on and retain the exact same FPS as you would otherwise with favor quality. I do think I prefer this. I like eye candy in general in situations where FPS is not critical, such as fast-paced online shooters and the like. 60 FPS on average in this title's benchmark morphs into closer to 80 FPS during normal gameplay, and frankly not too long ago these were numbers you could only dream of, with the 1060 costing more than this whole machine, including the monitor and peripherals. I must admit, I don't really check what settings Warzone is running at, I just let it choose its own, and this time it has pre-selected fairly high settings with the game running at 52 FPS on average with some excursions from the mean, but not enough to jeopardize the gameplay experience. Any experienced Warzone player will be able to dial in better settings. It's on my to-do list to play this game properly and fiddle with the settings, I just haven't gotten around to it yet. Farcry with FSR at ultra settings is running very smoothly with 52 FPS on average. Let me reiterate, this is a recent AAA title running on ultra settings on a complete system that barely costs 3 times the game's price. If that's not insane value, I don't know what is. That being said, unfortunately this is CPU bottleneck city. I was very much expecting this, as there is no way to ignore the fact that Far Cry 6's engine is single core bound, and this is not the 3200G's strong suit. Not that it really has a strong suit. Days Gone fared a lot better than I thought it would, considering it does not have FSR and this is at high settings. The FPS limiting factor ping-pongs between the CPU and GPU, which technically is still not okay, as you ideally always want to be GPU bound. But on the whole, considering it is an exploration game, over 60 FPS with great eye candy is a nice experience for most people. Now, I ran Assassin's Creed Valhalla at high settings with and without FSR. In the end, I ended up recording the run without FSR enabled by mistake that produced 48 FPS on average. Not an amazing result, but not bad considering the settings. When I reran the same benchmark with identical settings but FSR set to quality, and literally to no one's surprise, the frame rates jumped to 63 FPS on average. Not bad for a single toggle, eh? And although I'm rather picky when looking at graphics, at 1080p, even on a huge ultra-wide, it still looked amazing with no noticeable artifacting. And lastly for today we come to Cyberpunk that produces 55 FPS on average at high settings. Yes, you heard that right, high settings 1080p with FSR set to quality. Now obviously there is no ray tracing involved as the GPU does not support the technology, but again 55 FPS at high settings in the included benchmark no less. Considering that Cyberpunk hates quad cores and AMD processors more generally, the fact that we got 55 FPS simply blows my mind. Dropping FSR down to balance will provide over 60 FPS, but frankly the CPU becomes the main bottleneck, so it's not really worth the trade-off unless you reduce scroll densities and other CPU hungry options, which in turn quickly depopulate the world, making it noticeably less immersive, which, well, depending on what you want to achieve, might or might not be desirable. And well, that's about it. I hope you enjoyed this video and see you in the next one.